the issue of exoneration here is so important, and there's a sentence here that is all but an explicit invitation to Congress to impeach the president. I'm sorry, I'm trying to do several things. If other people have read this sentence, but I just think this sentence is enormously important.
Read it again.
The conclusion that Congress may apply the obstruction law to the president's corrupt exercise of the powers of office accords with our constitutional system of checks and balances and the principle that no person is above the law. That is, I don't think any other way to read that is saying, I, Robert Mueller, cannot enforce the obstruction of justice laws against the president because I am not empowered to do so under Department of Justice policy. But this is an invitation to Congress to say you can do it using the impeachment power. Now, I don't know if they will, I don't know if they should, but the idea that this is some sort of exoneration seems very highly contradictory to this.
And again, the Attorney General of the United States said this morning that Robert Mueller was not leaving these questions to Congress.
Right. Oh, also,
just read a sentence from a guy named Robert Mueller leaving these questions.
The notion, again, you mentioned, Lord, what Barr said this morning. It says right here, third, the president's intent, many of the president's acts directed at witnesses, including discouragement of cooperation with many of the president's acts, many of the president's acts directed at witnesses, including discouragement of cooperation with the government and suggestion of possible future pardons, took place in full public view.
So I guess the Attorney General presumed that we were not a literate nation who could then go back and read the 400 pages and actually identify, even in a Control F function, to go through the document and actually see that what he has presented has been misleading. Not only the first bite at the apple, but the second one on camera, which really leads me to say that not only is it talking about the missed opportunity about rising above politics, there's an issue for the Department of Justice now. The president for the last 22 months has been undermining the integrity and credibility of the FBI, the intelligence community, and the Department of Justice. They have pushed back and said, no, we actually are credible and have maintained our integrity. Now the very head of the Department of Justice has now said, oh, no, I didn't want you to actually read it. Just trust me of what I said. Now, when you verify the documents, it doesn't hold up.
Can I just say one thing about that? Because I think one of the points that Barr would make, and this isn't a defense of Barr, but Barr's, the thing that you're saying that he lied about, that he's misleading about, which was the president didn't stop anything that would have prevented Mueller from finishing his report, right? That's what he said. And we know that the report...
Well, the investigation. That's the important
part. The investigation, okay. We know that this report details instance after instance of the president trying to stop the investigation, trying to undermine the investigation, trying to convince witnesses not to cooperate, et cetera. So obviously the spirit of what Barr said is false. But technically, the investigation finished and there is a conclusion and there is a Mueller report. It is overly lawyerly language. It is misleading language. It is the kind of language you want in a defense attorney, not necessarily in an attorney general for the United States Department of Justice. But that is what he did today. I think that almost makes it worse because he knows what he did and how misleading.
And I don't agree that
the report was out.
You couldn't press him on.
And Pam, you also there's stuff in here about the president's written responses.
Right, exactly. As we're sort of comparing how Barr has handled this, he said today during the press conference that the White House, quote, fully cooperated, as we're talking about. But in this report, the special counsel said it found Trump's written answers to the team, quote, inadequate. And here's what it goes on to say. It says the special counsel agreed to receive written responses from Trump, but it, quote, viewed the written answers to be inadequate. We noted, among other things, that the president stated on more than 30 occasions that he, quote, does not recall or, quote, remember or have an independent recollection of information called for by the questions. Other answers were incomplete or imprecise, the report says. So basically, this is sort of a scathing criticism.
Just think about that for a moment. In written answers, the president of the United States is saying he doesn't recall. I mean,
over 30.
You have plenty of time.
More than 30 occasions.
Right. But you have plenty of time to like check your, file of fact. I mean, you can. It's not like he's answering in real time. These are lawyered up, prepared
That's
things.
What any lawyer.
Right, I know, but it's so
the ludicrous spirit of there's a tweet for everything. this is not just an ordinary president. This is a president who has said he has one of the great memories
of course.
of all time. So the notion, and I was reading through the answers, and when you see them one after another, virtually every answer begins, I have no independent recollection. Right. Now, this is an example of good lawyering by Rudy Giuliani, Jay Sekulow, who are not exposing him to criminal prosecution.
It's not all that advanced lawyering. I mean, I don't have a law degree. I could have told him to say that.
I'm trying to say something nice, Anderson. Okay, you know, it's like, but it is true that to see the answers in succession is, even by lawyer standard, kind of hilarious because they all begin the same way.
Let's bring in Laura Jarrett, our Justice Department correspondent. Laura, just to talk about these two things, because very clearly earlier today, Attorney General Barr said things that do not seem to pass the smell test. One, he said that the Robert Mueller did not kick the question of obstruction of justice to Congress, and I don't know any other way to read this than to say he's kicking it to Congress. And two, he said that the White House cooperated in every possible way and did not impede the investigation. And again, we have the special counsel saying that the written answers from the White House were inadequate, that he said he didn't recall things or remember things more than 30 occasions, that the White House, the president, tried to convince witnesses not to cooperate, et cetera. Doesn't that strike you as surprising, coming from a man like William Barr, who did have a reputation before taking this current job for being an establishment type character who wouldn't risk his reputation to protect someone like President Trump?
But he also has a reputation of a very broad view of executive power. And I think what we saw earlier today, and even what we saw several weeks ago with his 4-page letter, is an attempt to have a political narrative here that is crystal clear and presents the most charitable view for the president. He went out of his way today to say on every possible occasion, look, the president was facing an unprecedented situation. Of course he was angry. Of course he was lashing out. Of course he was saying all kinds of things to his officials and his administration. But what's pretty clear here is that Robert Mueller is very troubled by it. He obviously doesn't decide to exercise traditional prosecutorial judgment, but he's really wrestling with all of these different acts, so much so that he lays out for Congress, sort of chapter and verse, a roadmap for obstruction of justice. I mean, Congress can take this 400 pages right now and do everything it wants. It doesn't need a referral from Barr. That was a political decision. That was a political lens that the Attorney General chose to make at the beginning of this day. And the fact that he did it before we saw the report, I don't think helped the president on this, because the report now speaks for itself. And the report itself is so detailed and so damning on so many different issues. I think it's going to be hard for Barr to now explain when he has to go to Capitol Hill in a couple weeks. On May 1st, he's scheduled to go up there and defend the report, and he's going to have to answer all these questions. And I don't know how he walks that back.
Though we should point out, Pam Brown, just reading it now, the president's attorneys, it's the president's attorneys. They have released now the entire written statement that the president made to Mueller. I don't know if this is something that the Department of Justice gave them a heads up about in advance so that they would have this prepared in order to release it, but apparently now they have just released it.
Right, and I want to be able to actually read this before commenting on it too much, but basically the lawyers are now releasing the questionnaire that the president answered that we were just talking about on air. What they want to do clearly is to rebut that what special counsel is saying, that it was inadequate, the responses were inadequate, and give more context to the more than 30 occasions where the president says do not recall. But one part that I am seeing in this that is relevant is about the Don Jr. meeting at Trump Tower and whether the president had any recollection or any heads up about this meeting happening, the offer of Russian dirt. And the answer to that was the president says, I do not recall being aware during the campaign of communications between Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, or Jared Kushner, and any member or representative of the Agalarov family, Robert Goldstone, Natalia Veselnitskaya, whose name I was not familiar with, or anyone I understood to be a Russian official. So there the president saying that he has no recollection of knowing about the meeting in advance. But of course, we're still looking through this.
But not saying he didn't know in advance, just saying he has
no
recollection.
And this goes back and shows us another lie that the White House told, whether it was knowing or not, when they said that the president didn't dictate the misleading statement about that meeting. And of course, we later learned from his attorneys in a statement to the special counsel that he did dictate it, something Sarah Sanders never explained, even though reporters asked repeatedly, why did you say he certainly didn't dictate it if he did dictate it? And then from this report, we're learning that Donald Trump Jr. actually was worried about the statement his dad wanted to put out because he wanted the word primarily to be in there to imply that the meeting could have been about other things other than adoptions. And Hope Hicks wrote back that the president was worried about including the word primarily. And of course, ultimately, that word was included, but it shows how they went back and forth and how the president wanted to put out as little as possible about that meeting in a statement.